welcome back to another Storage Authority webinar, first one of 2026. We think this year is set up to be a banner year. We have a new Fed chair in like 4 months, I think it is. And I know they're eyeing on reducing interest rates, and we know that's going to accelerate the housing turnover, and that's really been at currently a 40-year low. So that's really going to help the self-storage demand. Quick intro to us, Garrett, Byrd here. We have Marc, Goodin, and Josh Parker of the Storage Authority team. We have 60 years of experience on our team. Our primary focus is to provide guidance into self-storage ownership for busy professionals who really want to build wealth on their terms. But, we love giving back to the community. So here we are sharing. I'm going to go fast, probably 2 to 4 minutes a slide. But my goal is to leave here able to evaluate a site faster and more accurately than 70-80% of the brokerage community. Here we go. Having a little issue with there we go. All right. So what is square foot per capita? This is really the metric we've used for decades in our industry. It's just evolved. Our industry has evolved. The rule of thumb is 7 to 8. That's the national average that you hear everybody talking about. But why is it misleading? Trade area definitions vary widely. We're talking about 2 mile, 3 mile versus the 5 mile in drive time. This includes old, obsolete 1980s facilities that functionally aren't competitive, honestly. It ignores population, density, income, growth trajectory. So it's just somewhat of it's an important metric, the supply, but it's somewhat of an outdated metric. So the ongoing myth is, a low square foot per capita, good market, a high number, bad market, stay away from that. And, it's just not the case anymore. It's the square foot per capita is really a lagging indicator, if you will. It tells you what happened 5 years ago, not what the demand is today. Say a market with 10 square foot per capita can still be undersupplied if the rates are strong and the churn is high. So really, you got to use this as really a yellow flag at best, never red or green light. Jumping into population here, most developers look at 20 to 50,000 people in a 2, 3, 4 mile radius. You really want to focus on the density and growth trajectory rather than just the current head count. There's some fantastic tools out there, Radius and Store Track, not only to see the population, but they have some great tools where you can see, future planned developments that are coming, more rooftops that are coming. But bottom line is, you got to pass it on the real-time numbers today. And everybody asks me, which one do you like best? Is it Radius or Store Track? And honestly, they're both great data. They both have fantastic teams. So, big on information enhances everything. So consume it all. It's worth it when you're building something like this to see the different data points. A pro tip for population is, look at the daytime population workers versus nighttime population residents. If you're near a major hospital or, office park, your actual customer base is much larger than the census data. All right, visibility. Self-storage is an impulse plus necessity business. Customers need to see your sign repeatedly, and your building is your primary billboard, right? Physical visibility is still the number one driver. Top of mind awareness. You want to think, memory folder, which makes it a custom. With memory folder, that's my term is, you got to get in the customer's future mind where they see you 7, 8 times, and when they want to rent, they're going to rent from you. But what's important about that is when they drive by you all the time, and of course we're in such a on-demand society now. They're looking on their phones and they see your listing on the phone now, but they pass you all the time, and that visibility is going to leapfrog those other searches because they see you, they see your name, they're familiar with your brand, and that's really what makes visibility and traffic counts critical. Some key levers: daily traffic volume, speed of the traffic, line of sight distance, ease of turning in and out. Corner on the way locations can cut required marketing spend dramatically because the road does the advertising for you. A couple of tips here. Traffic count alone isn't enough. Check the speed limit of the road type. 45 to 55 mile an hour limited access road with 40,000 cars a day is often worse than a 35-mile-an-hour artery road with 25,000 cars a day, because drivers can read your sign and safely turn into your facility. You can perform a line of sight type of test here. So as you identify your location, and say you're doing an audit and it's 45 miles an hour, when you drive by that location, within 3 seconds, can you tell, is it self storage? So that's important. And if you can't, you're probably going to increase your Google ad spend by 20%, because customers are just zipping by you, and they're not turning to recognize that you're self-storage. This location on the screen, this is our Orlando Lakes location in Florida, that was with us. Beautiful location, but you can see ease access, ease turn in. The amount of cars that were going by this site was great. All right, so getting into lot, parcel, and efficiency. And you can see, self-storage, what's great about self-storage is, as long as we get a little bit of the sliver of that frontage, it works. So we can take the less desirable lots, and usually at a discount if you have the right team to negotiate with you. But as long as we get some of that gold frontage, perfect. But obviously we can take that L-shaped lot too, and then deal with the seller and get a better deal. The basics really, your lot dictates the business model before you even draw your site plan. You want to focus on usable square footage, setbacks, retention, slope, zoning buffers, not just the acreage. So all that falls into place. Many developers, miss the utility easements. This destroys site efficiency. So, always pull the civil CAD base map early, and this is going to help you calculate, your net rentable yield. A couple of things you want to check also is your flood zone and your wetland overlays, especially for us in Florida, because a retention basin that can eat 20 to 40% of your usable ground. Then all of a sudden you thought you had 6 acres, you got 4 acres. Check your phase 1 environments. That you're going to find out if this was a gas station or an old dry cleaner. And then these surprises, these environmental surprises, they kill more off-market deals than price. So, early due diligence, you got to move fast on this stuff when you're looking at land. Lastly, on the land and the parcel, check your topo, your topography. A cheap lot with 15 grade slope, can change the cost, $500,000. An additional retaining wall or dirt work, killing your ROI before you even pour concrete. So many factors, move into this, when you're looking at land, and you can't afford to go pay $2 to $4 million. You're not going to make a return on your investment. So all this has to be looked into early. All right, so I'm going to ship it over to Marc, and CEO of Storage Authority, civil engineer by trade, but he's got decades of experience with emotional data. So I'll let him give a little input here.
All right, thanks, Garrett. Looks like we're about catching up. At the end of this, we'll be halfway through. The missing link to finding land for many new investors and developers is understanding emotional data to their advantage. Emotional data is data you see and feel with your own eyes. It provides an alternate reality or confirms the online empirical data, or it provides new data. There's 2 ways to obtain emotional data, and one is word of mouth. You talk to the town officials, the newspaper, what's happening in town. We have a site in Detroit that many people passed up, but the emotional data told us this is an up and coming community. Both the city and investors are spending millions of dollars at this time improving this area. So, the one set of data said no, but the emotional data was so strong and said yes, we're moving forward with that site. The second way to obtain emotional data is to observe the site in the 5-mile radius. When you read data, it doesn't tell you the whole picture if you have not been out to that site. I first learned of emotional data when I designed the first Walmart in the state of Connecticut. Before we started design, one of the Waltons flew out for the day and dinner, drove through the community, met the people. The next day, he approved that site. It doesn't sound like a big to-do, but let me tell you this story. And I think it was 1962, Walmart and Kmart came on the scene at the exact same year. Kmart quickly pulled ahead of Walmart by a couple of hundred stores by leveraging tons of standard data. Walmart used emotional data. Now, Kmart is out of business. No one can even tell me who the founder was. And the Walton family is the richest family in the world. I believe it's partially due to their use of emotional data. Sometimes empirical data that's provided to us is an average. And many locations are not the same throughout the 5-mile competition radius. So again, the best way to see if it's a positive or negative is by driving the area. There's a huge difference in being the best versus the worst location in a 5-mile radius. And you don't always see that with the online data. Safety is typically the second reason people rent self-storage after convenience. And safety is a hard one to tell by the numbers. Even income doesn't necessarily relate to safety. And you could be on the edge of safety, or another two or three streets further down, the ladies are going to say, hey, this place is great. It's not dark and dingy and everything. So again, you got to use that emotional data. The empirical data may tell you the 3-mile population is too low to build. I own a self-storage with, about 15,000 people in the 3-mile radius. Normally, I would not tell people to build with that low of a population. But in this instance, there's a large population in 15 minutes in one direction and a large population in 15 minutes in another direction. And those populations are constantly going back and forth, driving right past our site. So the traffic is extremely large. And both of these communities have a bad reputation when it comes to being safe. So a lot of people will travel a lot further because it's on their way to work. It's on their, we're between Hartford and Mansfield, Connecticut, where the university is. So a lot of people are traveling back and forth. And so you've got to see that emotional data to understand it. I'll give you one warning. Some people get emotional data wrong when it comes to demand. I can't tell you how many people have called us and Garrett and said, there's no self-storage anywhere. This is a perfect site. But when we do a quick Google nearby self-storage review, there's 5 or 6 facilities. So, you've got to be careful. The idea is that, this emotional data, it does not mean a gut feeling. It actually means you've done some research in person. I'm kind of out of time here, but if you want to hear about the entire emotional data story and how it can be a big advantage to you, you can check out the article I wrote on Inside Self Storage magazine, or you can email me for a copy. It's Marc, M-A-R-C, at storageauthority.com. I'm out of time. I've got several good examples I can share with you. If you're interested, just ask during the Q&A, and I'll give you some specific examples. With that, I'll pass it back to you, Garrett.
All right, appreciate it, Marc. Yeah, I was honestly just talking to a gentleman in Florida. Sent me an article. His location was so overbuilt. Popped into one of the softwares and sent him a couple of screenshots, and he was like, oh, maybe not. So it's just really what you want to read into, and just reading articles and oversaturation, that's not the way to go. All right, getting into percent stock and pipeline. Everybody's asking like what's percent stock lately, and it's just really pressure on new facilities coming to the market. The last thing you want to be in an area where you got 2 or 3 facilities, and maybe maybe the whole area could make sense to support 2 or 3 facilities, but the absorption rate, you're gonna lease up super slow, because self-storage isn't just get a unit because it's a driver unit. You're moving, some kind of event happened in your life. So you got to be mindful of being in areas where there's a ton in the pipeline. 2 or 3 facilities in a 3-mile radius makes a huge difference, even if it has if it makes sense and the rates are strong and low square foot per capita. So you got to be mindful of that. We use tools, again, going back to store, track, and radius. Fantastic for getting into the search area you want, and you're going to see the pipeline that's coming in the future, or when the permits got pulled. I was looking at one just the other day where the permit was pulled like 4 years ago, but it's still in it still could be recognized as a possible a possible new build. And then developers today are making a decision on, do I want to build here or not? So if you don't take that next leg of investigation to find out if that's a real site or did somebody just pull a permit a while back, that could influence your decision. You want to be aware of, kind of what I'm mentioning now, pipeline ghosts, announced projects that never break ground. You want to dig into lender commitments and equity raises. If it's just a broker rumor, you just want to discount that, 70, 80%. It's not going to come to market. A couple ways you can validate that is, validate any new permits through the county GIS or environmental review filings. Just don't go off of press releases because, somebody said they were going to build self-storage. A pro tip here would be, if there's a stalled project out there and it looks like an opportunity, contact that developer to purchase the project, see what's going on with it. Maybe they ran out of money, maybe a life event happened, but it could, their fault could be an opportunity for you. So, you got to look at, both sides of the pipeline. Could be an opportunity or, it just could never be coming to market. Competition, this is where you can set yourself apart, especially with, new builds and unfortunately, a lot of the facilities that were built in the older, 80s, 90s, early 2000s, it's just not apples to apples. We would rule them out. Feasibility expert would rule them out. You just got to think about the customer mindset. Not all 10 by 10s are equal. Building design, access type, branding change, it changes everything. You have to intimately know your competition, what your advantage are going to be, and you got to supersize that on your community marketing. Physical occupancy can be misleading as well. 95%, physical occupied 1980s facility with a $90 10 by 10. It's not nearly a threat of a 85% occupied 2022 REIT. Their facilities pushing a $150 10 by 10. You got to separate your classes, like I have here, the tiers, and also you do an A, B, or C. You can base it off security, visibility, age, accessibility. All that makes a difference. A pro tip here is, when you're thinking about identifying a market and this is going to be one of your top competitors, walk the competitor site. Note the gate technology, the loading design, the manager quality. I mean, that's huge too. I've seen A sites get dropped down to C or C minus sites because you got a poor manager. So real competition isn't price. It's perception of safety and ease to access. Another one would be use drone footage or aerial maps to show your site's features and visibility advantage over the older competitors. Remember, if you want to win, you got to think retail and hospitality when you're doing your marketing. Another thing you can review here when you're checking out your competition is map the customers' reviews. A competitor with 300 plus Google reviews, averaging say 4.8 rating, they're capturing a big market share in that market. So you got to see what they're doing, and can we compete and then outwork them. For anybody listening, if you want our comprehensive competition review, go ahead and shoot me an email at Garrett@storageauthority.com. Just put comp shop or something in the subject line, and I'll be sure to get that over to you. I'll have my email address as well on the last slide. All right, this is rates. This is probably in a lot of our philosophy, probably the number one driver right now. You got to look at the rates in any given market. If you're around a bunch of mom and pops charging 90 cents or meaning like your 10 by 10 is going to be $90 or 110. It's tough to build a brand new, $10 million or $7 million new build and compete when we're at $1.69 and they're at 90 cents. I mean, we'll get our customers, but you got to be mindful of the market you're in as well. So rates, like street rates, honestly, not demographics, are really the purest reflection of supply and demand balance. If you're tracking lease friction, if operators stop discounting, yet maintain occupancy, the market still has unfilled demand. So if all of a sudden you see everybody with no more discounts or last unit, that's a good tell that high rates, no more discounts. That's a good market, no matter what the square foot per capita says. a pro tip, and I definitely recommend this to anybody who either you identified a market or you have an option to purchase, and early on, immediately identify your top 2 or 3 competitors and immediately go out and rent a 10 by 10. Just so you're a customer in there and you're going to be able to see the velocity of how fast they give their rate increases. Web rates are just an advertising teaser rate. That's not the actual rate. You can't build your P&L off that, but you need that information from your competitors of how fast they're going to raise their rates. And I can just give you an example of one we did here in Sarasota. We rented, fantastic price. It was like $62 or $65 for a climate control 10 by 10. That's unheard of, a few years back. Within 3 months, it went to 132. And then within 3 months after that, it went to like 209. So, that velocity is just mind blowing. But, if you build your P&L off of the $65, there's just no way it's going to happen. So you just got to be mindful of that, get that information, rent those units, spend a little bit of extra money on getting that information so you can make a good decision. So we moved quick. I think that's at 25, 26 minutes. In closing, let me just recap. Stop letting square foot per capita be your primary filter. You want to prioritize rates, your competition quality, pipeline percentage, visibility, population growth, parcel feasibility, and emotional trends. So really the takeaway here is the best developers win by stacking multiple green lights across these factors, not just chasing one magic ratio or metric. So definitely happy to take questions, but before we get there, Marc, do you have any input you want to add?
It is a long process to find land. You've got to put substantial time in, week after week after week, and it's still going to take you a long time. We've had a few franchisees trying to wait on the real estate brokers. The real estate brokers are not going to find that land. So you've got to put a system together and be consistent with it in order to find land. If you don't have the time, Storage Authority will find that land for you. Of course, it's going to cost you some additional funds, but it's well worth it versus not getting in the self-storage market. You see a lot of sites that are for sale that have been predetermined for self-storage or actually approved for self-storage. They add anywhere from 400,000 to 400,000 to, let me see, 400,000 to a couple $1,000,000 in value by getting approvals. So that's part of Storage Authority is helping you find that land. We have all the guidance. We're there 24/7 to talk with you and go over it. But if you can't find the land, you still want to get in self-storage. It's an incredible business. You have to remember, we hear all these tough times and moving and everything, but self-storage is a long-term business. And for the long term, things look great.
Awesome. Go ahead and feel free to put any questions you have in the comments, and we'll gladly kind of open up the forum now. If anybody wants to stick around for some Q&A, we try to do these lightning fast webinar guidance because who wants to really spend an hour on a webinar? So we try to move quick and provide some good tools that you can use and deploy out there in while you're looking for land. Let's see. We have a question here from Alexander. Have a development site almost completed. For those lease-up strategies, you typically reduce rates like public storage and raise rates quickly over time, or try to achieve higher rates from the beginning. And I'll go ahead and answer that, Marc. You can have a real quick honeymoon discount, but the last thing you want to do is have your facility and everybody thinks you're the dollar move-in or these bait and switch rates. If you're going to be the hometown self-storage and be 30% higher, you gotta not only be prove it to the customer, prove it to the community. You can't just go out there and get somebody in for $99 and raise them up to $189 in month 2. It's just the fastest way to lose trust in the community. And if you want to be the hometown self-storage, you really gotta get out there and we're huge on outward marketing. Not a lot of the REITs want to do this, so it's an advantage to us. Talking about a 3-mile radius where we just want to dominate and have 100 business alliances. So you can have some, to answer your question, Alexander, you you can have an initial honeymoon discount, but the goal is wean that facility off those discounts as fast as possible, and just let your rates speak for themselves and command that rate. Any more questions coming in? As the questions do come in, we definitely feel like this year is going to be set up for success. As the rates start to come down, we're going to see that housing market, all that pin up demand, buyers on the sidelines, sellers had just been sitting on a 3 or 4% rate. They just refused to move. But I think I read a stat. It was like it was down to like 3.9 million when typically we're at 6 million transitions and the housing. So that's huge, and that's a big driver. We're still in transition business, so we need that movement to have our facilities fill up fast and then keep that churn going. Right now, it's just got to be an absolute necessity if somebody's actually moving. Let's see. Another one from Alexander. What are you doing to achieve 100 business alliances? You got to have a good ground game. You got to get out there, and we have a huge marketing calendar, and then we keep track of obviously your number ones are going to be your movers, your realtors, your home inspectors, but you got to actually go out there and introduce yourself to the local pizzeria. It could be the hair salon. The big thing is we don't just go in there and say, hey, Storage Authority, send us business. We go in there, how we train the managers. We're excited to be part of the community. We're in the transition business, so we have 600 to 700 units, and new neighbors really come into our community. So we really like them to either provide some kind of a rack card or discount, because we like to hand out $1,000 worth of savings, when somebody does a facility tour with us. So you build up that 100 business alliances, and then you have to visit them once a quarter. So it's 2 to 3 hours a week, and you're hitting 10 a week, dropping off some marketing collateral, letting them know if you're running low on any discounts that they might have provided, or you might have one big sheet that they okayed on the discount. It could be a free pizza, $5 off the haircut, anything like that. But once they see that, we want to make their bottom right, or their revenue increase, and we're not just in it for us, that's really how you build that alliance. See, we got another one coming in. What are your thoughts on land leases for self-storage? You want to take this one, Marc?
We do not see too many land leases for self-storage. Owning that business is half of your profit. It's somebody else owns that land, and at the very least you need a 100-year lease because the value is selling that at some point or refinancing at some point. If you have a land lease, hopefully you have a way to buy that property at some point down in the future. But we just don't see it that often, because owning the business and the land is significant over time, and you're building up somebody else's value by having a land lease. But you got to look at the numbers. If you get a 100-year land lease at something that's low market, there could be an opportunity.
If any more questions come in, go ahead and throw them in the comments. Next February 19th, we're going to be doing, Marc's actually going to be putting on 7 reasons why self-storage development is not for you. Good one to tune in for if you're on the fence. Might be the push you needed to get in the game, but join us for that. We'll be sending out some links that you can go ahead and save your seat for that as well. Another one, if you want our 12 proven keys to self-storage development success, go ahead and shoot me an email as well. Just put that in the subject line.